From a personal point of view,
After decades of quiet understanding, everything changed behind palace walls. King Charles made one unexpected decision that transformed the atmosphere inside the royal household. With a single signature, years of private arrangements, family favors, and special access came to an abrupt end. For Camilla, it was more than an official action, it was a deeply personal message. For her relatives, it signaled that a long-standing privilege had finally ended. And for the monarchy, it became the moment many believed the king had placed duty ahead of personal comfort. Before we uncover what this dramatic decision could mean for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you never miss another update. Charles remained seated alone at his desk, carefully reading the final page once more. He paused, then read it again, almost hoping the words would somehow feel less severe. They never did. The palace directive, an official instruction from the monarch that reshapes the operation of the royal household, removed Camilla's relatives from the special privileges they had quietly enjoyed since the beginning of his reign. Access to private residences, royal travel assistance, ceremonial positioning, and informal household influence were no longer treated as flexible courtesies. They had now been officially withdrawn. That mattered because the royal household depends on clear boundaries. Once private relatives begin moving through palace life as permanent insiders, the monarchy risks appearing less like a public institution and more like a family possession. Camilla received the news inside a private sitting room, and her expression changed before she spoke a single word. She immediately recognized the difference between a temporary restriction and a permanent boundary. The Queen Consort had weathered many difficult moments before, but this one felt different because it reached beyond her and affected the people closest to her. Her family had never worn the crown, yet they had lived close to the influence of the throne, protected by familiarity, strengthened by routine, and quietly supported by the king's affection. Now that sense of security had suddenly disappeared. Charles gently placed his pen on the desk, carrying the quiet weight of a husband who knew he had hurt the woman beside him, while the monarch within him refused to retreat from his responsibility. One senior aide noticed the most striking detail. Throughout the entire document, Charles deliberately avoided mentioning Camilla by name, making the order seem even more formal rather than compassionate. It did not criticize her. It offered no explanation. It simply removed the privileges connected to her family with the unmistakable authority of the crown. Experienced palace aides immediately understood why that detail mattered. By leaving her name out, the order appeared to be an institutional decision rather than a personal one. Even so, everyone inside the palace understood exactly who would feel its emotional impact. The king had done more than establish a boundary. He had drawn a clear line between personal loyalty and royal responsibility. As the final signature dried, an unsettling question quietly spread through the palace corridors. Who had influenced King Charles to reach this extraordinary decision? Every major royal decision affects people long before the public ever hears about it. This was never simply about access passes, seating arrangements, or official transport. It was about belonging. Camilla watched her family slowly pulled away from the royal world she had spent decades becoming part of. Charles, however, saw something very different. A monarchy where the line between public service and personal loyalty had begun to fade. Camilla held the written summary carefully in both hands, and for a brief moment the pages seemed far heavier than the paper itself. Her children and close relatives had long existed on the edge of royal life, not as working royals or official members of the institution, but as people whose closeness to the Queen Consort naturally placed them near the center of palace life. That mattered because royal protocol, the system of rules that governs access, rank, movement, and ceremonial position, determines far more than where someone stands. It quietly decides who is trusted to stand close to the crown. For years, Camilla's family had benefited from an unspoken level of acceptance, especially during private gatherings, estate visits, and ceremonial occasions where the public only saw polished tradition while the palace understood the hidden order behind it. Charles understood the consequences before anyone needed to explain them. He had not approved the order out of anger. He signed it because he believed the monarchy could no longer continue bending around private comfort without placing something much greater at risk. Every quiet exception, every informal approval, every familiar name added to a list without question gradually formed a pattern. And patterns eventually become expectations. Expectations become entitlement. That, in Charles's view, was the real danger. Camilla experienced the decision as a wife and mother, while Charles carried it as a monarch who had finally accepted that affection had slowly blurred an important boundary. Her pain was deeply personal. His burden was constitutional in the most human sense. He believed the throne had to remain protected from appearing to belong to anyone's private circle. Prince William's name appeared nowhere in the official order, yet that very absence only intensified the whispers inside the palace. Publicly, the prince remained completely silent. Even so, several senior aides quietly believed that many of the strongest provisions reflected concerns he had expressed long before. William had always viewed the monarchy through the eyes of the future sovereign. He understood that he would inherit not only the crown itself but also every unresolved issue left behind. In his view, even small privileges could eventually become significant problems if they remained unchallenged. Charles understood that reality as well. At the same time, he knew Camilla would experience every withdrawn privilege as another deeply personal rejection. Then came the quiet moment that made everything impossible to ignore. A senior court official opened the palace's internal access records and calmly removed the familiar family names one after another. There was no announcement, no confrontation, and no dramatic exchange. It was simply an administrative task carried out with professional precision. Yet the effect felt like a silent exile. Camilla required no explanation. She immediately understood what those changes represented. Her relatives had not been removed from her life, but they had unquestionably been moved away from the influence of royal authority. Inside the palace, everyone realized that the paperwork itself was only the beginning. To truly understand why King Charles had finally acted, it was necessary to return to the single moment that transformed quiet concern into unavoidable action. Every royal crisis begins with one unforgettable moment. Sometimes it is one sentence spoken too confidently, one glance that reveals too much, or one mistake that can never be taken back. For Charles and Camilla, that turning point arrived during a private dinner at Windsor, when what seemed like an ordinary remark about future royal access unexpectedly exposed a far deeper concern growing within the monarchy. Charles heard the remark before anyone had the chance to soften its impact. One of Camilla's relatives spoke with surprising confidence about continuing to enjoy access to royal residences even after Charles's reign, almost as though closeness to the Queen Consort guaranteed a permanent place within royal life. A royal residence, a property used by members of the monarchy for official duties or private living, was never intended to feel like a lasting privilege for people outside the direct royal family. That was exactly why the comment struck such a powerful chord. The words were not spoken loudly, nor were they openly disrespectful. Yet they carried a quiet certainty that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Inside palace circles, confidence of that kind can quickly resemble entitlement. William became noticeably still. He did not challenge the remark or create a scene. Instead, he remained silent, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over everyone present. Charles immediately noticed the expression on his son's face and realized this was no ordinary awkward dinner conversation. The issue had suddenly become much larger than one family gathering. It had raised a question every monarch eventually faces. What happens when private affection begins producing public consequences? Camilla attempted to ease the tension with a restrained smile, offering warmth where discomfort had begun to spread. Even she could sense that something had shifted. Her family had not deliberately crossed any official boundary, but for the first time, that invisible boundary had become impossible to ignore. Charles carried that single conversation with him long after the dinner had ended. He refused to dismiss it as casual gossip. Instead, he treated it as evidence. The following morning, the king requested a confidential review covering access permissions, travel arrangements, staff support, and ceremonial privileges connected to Camilla's relatives. The private briefing revealed something palace conversations never could: a growing pattern. There had been quiet exceptions over the years that were never officially approved, yet gradually became accepted through repetition. A vehicle arranged here, a residence made available there, a discreet adjustment to a ceremonial guest list. Individually, none of these actions appeared significant. Together, however, they revealed something far more concerning. Camilla had no idea how deeply that single dinner conversation had changed everything. She only noticed that Charles had become noticeably quieter. William seemed to understand far more than he revealed, and throughout the palace, the incident everyone wished would disappear had quietly become the foundation of a decision that could no longer be avoided. When Charles finally chose to speak with Camilla about the matter, the emotional weight of that evening returned with full force. The conversation happened in complete privacy. There were no advisors present, no secretaries recording notes, and no palace officials carefully choosing words. It was simply Charles and Camilla facing one another alone. For the first time, the question was no longer whether he loved her. It was whether that love could survive the boundary the crown now required him to enforce. Charles arranged the meeting before the wider royal household received formal notice of the order, making sure Camilla would hear the truth directly from him rather than through whispers in the palace corridors or official instructions passed between staff. The final summary rested quietly on the table between them, plain, direct, and impossible to ignore. It carried the authority of a palace directive, meaning an official command that would immediately reshape the operation of the royal household. That distinction mattered because once the order moved beyond Charles's personal control, it would no longer remain a private discussion. It would become official policy. It would become part of the institution itself. And once that happened, neither history, loyalty, nor personal affection could soften its impact. Camilla did not immediately reach for the document. Instead, she searched Charles's face, as though the answer was already written there. Then she quietly asked the question he had dreaded most. "Is my family being punished?" Charles answered with great care, knowing one careless sentence could transform heartbreak into betrayal. He told her that the monarchy was being protected, not that her family was being punished. But those words brought her little comfort. Camilla understood what remained unspoken. Her relatives were not being distanced because of one isolated mistake. They were being moved back because the pattern surrounding them had become too difficult for the institution to defend. Charles slowly reached toward the document, then paused before touching it. That brief hesitation revealed far more than any official statement ever could. He was not emotionally detached. He understood that this decision reached into the life they had built together and disrupted the private circle that had given Camilla comfort after years of public scrutiny. Yet the king also believed that royal access, the privilege to enter royal residences, attend official gatherings, travel with palace support, and remain close to the monarchy's private world, could no longer exist simply for personal convenience. The crown had endured for generations because it separated personal affection from royal authority. Now Charles believed he had no choice but to uphold that principle within his own marriage. Camilla gradually realized the true scale of the decision. This was never directed at a single relative, nor was it simply a reaction to one uncomfortable dinner conversation. It removed an entire network of informal privileges that had quietly developed around her family over the years. Charles never raised his voice, but the certainty behind his words carried enormous weight. From this point forward, royal access would be determined by the needs of the institution rather than personal closeness. Once Camilla walked out of that room, the issue stopped being only a private heartbreak. It became a test of how firmly the monarchy could protect its own boundaries. Royal authority rarely announces itself through dramatic speeches. Instead, it moves quietly through official files, confidential briefings, sealed offices, and carefully chosen language. Behind Charles's unexpected order stood a much larger purpose, the future direction of the monarchy itself. This was no longer only about Camilla's relatives. It had become a question of whether the king could clearly separate his private household from the institution before William inherited a far more complicated situation. William studied the confidential briefing without saying a word, and that silence carried greater weight than anger ever could. The Palace Review focused on 4 difficult questions: who had access, what precedent had been created, how much it cost, and how the public might react if every detail ever became known. A precedent, a previous decision that establishes a standard for future situations, mattered because the monarchy depends upon consistency. Once one private family is allowed to move too freely within royal privilege, others may eventually expect the same treatment. When a single exception becomes routine, the entire institution begins to appear less disciplined. And inside the palace, weakness is never viewed as simple weakness. It becomes an open invitation. Charles fully understood that warning, but understanding it did not lessen the emotional cost. Senior advisors had repeatedly cautioned that informal privileges extended to private relatives could weaken the monarchy's image of discipline and public service, especially during a period when the public expected greater accountability. The king could defend Camilla as his wife. He could defend her rightful place beside him. But defending every unofficial privilege that had gradually formed around her relatives was a very different matter. Over the years, the Queen Consort's family had quietly become part of the rhythm of palace life. Now that familiar pattern was being weighed against the responsibilities of the crown itself. Charles felt trapped between 2 painful realities. His marriage deserved loyalty, yet the monarchy required distance. Every decision protected one side while inevitably hurting the other. William finally closed the briefing folder with deliberate calm. He did not speak like someone challenging his father. He spoke as the future king, carrying responsibilities that would one day become his own. He explained that clear boundaries needed to be established now rather than later because later would mean inheriting not only the crown, but also the resentment created by years of blurred privilege. Charles immediately understood the deeper meaning behind those words. This was not about punishment. It was about preparing the monarchy for the future. It was a difficult act of correction before uncertainty hardened into expectation. The new order returned complete authority over household access to the sovereign's office, meaning the king's official administrative department would now control who received entry, attended royal functions, travelled with palace support, and qualified for household assistance. One particular clause carried the greatest impact. From that point forward, Camilla's relatives would no longer be automatically treated as extensions of royal household privilege during major state occasions. There would be no guaranteed placement, no quiet assumptions, and no invisible protection based solely on personal closeness. The system had officially changed. And its very first consequence was already approaching, not through a dramatic announcement, but through a revised guest list, a cancelled arrangement, and a quiet humiliation that Camilla could not ignore. Although the order had been written in careful and formal language, its first consequences quickly became impossible to ignore. By the following morning, the matter had already moved beyond private palace discussions. It began appearing in guest lists, schedules, invitations, and access records. Familiar names that once passed effortlessly through royal systems were now being reviewed one by one. For Camilla, the humiliation was not loud or dramatic. It was something far more difficult to face, quiet, administrative, and impossible to challenge. She watched the first visible change unfold with a calmness that deeply concerned the aides standing nearby. A familiar family name connected to an upcoming Windsor gathering had quietly disappeared from the internal attendance list. To an outsider, the adjustment seemed insignificant. Inside palace life, however, it carried enormous meaning. Event protocol, the detailed system that determines who attends, where they stand, how they arrive, and what official support they receive, holds remarkable influence within the monarchy. It silently reveals who remains trusted, who stands close to the crown, and who has been moved further away. That was why this change mattered so much. Camilla's relatives would no longer be treated as an automatic extension of the royal household. They could still remain family. They could still be loved. But closeness to the queen consort would no longer provide unofficial authority inside palace life. When Charles learned that the changes had already begun, he remained silent for several moments before quietly asking whether Camilla had been informed with compassion. Although he had personally approved the order, witnessing its immediate effects still weighed heavily on him. Palace staff moved efficiently through updated guest arrangements, travel permissions, household access procedures, and ceremonial instructions with disciplined precision. Royal travel approval, the authorization for official transportation, security coordination, and palace-supported movement had always represented more than simple convenience. It quietly signaled that the palace regarded someone as close enough to receive institutional support. Removing that support did far more than reduce privileges. It changed perception. It informed every department that personal family comfort would no longer be woven into the machinery of the monarchy. Camilla understood that message long before anyone attempted to explain it. She could accept that palace policies sometimes changed, but this decision felt like something much deeper. It seemed to reshape her family's place within royal life itself. One planned appearance involving one of Camilla's relatives was quietly removed because the new directive no longer supported privileged placement at a major royal event. There was no public dispute, no raised voices, and no official confrontation. Yet the cancellation carried the emotional weight of a door quietly closing. Her family had not been rejected, but they had unquestionably been reassigned to a different place within the royal structure. That distinction felt cold, and the emotional impact was impossible to ignore. Charles slowly realized that the order had accomplished far more than simply removing privileges. It had fundamentally changed how Camilla's relatives would be viewed inside palace life. Those once protected by personal connection would now be judged only by official role, public responsibility, and institutional necessity. The king had sought clarity, but clarity came with a painful cost. It removed the comfort of long-standing habits, turned years of informal arrangements into evidence, and required personal affection to answer to royal responsibility. As the consequences became increasingly personal, Charles found himself confronting the emotional weight of the boundary he had chosen to establish. The defining moment arrived away from cameras and public attention. There were no official announcements or ceremonial speeches, only a father and son standing beneath the burden of a monarchy they would each carry in different ways. Charles had made the decision, but William fully understood its significance. During that private conversation, the future king did not celebrate Camilla's disappointment. Instead, he reminded his father why the monarchy sometimes survives only by making the most difficult choices for those closest to it. Charles had invited William to meet after the first wave of palace changes had already taken effect. The request carried far more emotion than any formal summons ever could. He wanted no advisors in the room, no carefully prepared language, and no polished explanations. He wanted only his son. William, the heir expected one day to inherit the crown, immediately understood why the meeting mattered before a single word had been spoken. This was no longer simply about palace policy. It had become a question of legacy. Every decision Charles made now would either make William's future easier, or leave him burdened with problems that had quietly grown through years of affection, hesitation, and silence. Charles openly admitted that the order had deeply hurt Camilla, and making that confession seemed almost harder than signing the document itself. He did not attempt to justify her pain or hide behind royal duty. He simply acknowledged that the woman standing beside him had suffered because of a boundary he believed the monarchy could no longer avoid. William responded with calm restraint rather than satisfaction. He explained that clear boundaries are not acts of cruelty when they protect the institution from confusion, resentment, and future conflict. Those words carried tremendous weight because the monarchy has always survived by placing public responsibility above private emotion, even when the personal cost is heartbreaking. Finally, William spoke the sentence Charles had both feared and needed to hear. The crown cannot become a refuge for private entitlement. Those quiet words settled heavily between them. In that moment, Charles fully understood that his son had never supported the decision out of hostility toward Camilla. He had supported it because he wanted to protect the future of the monarchy. William had witnessed how blurred privileges could become public controversy, how small favors could grow into lasting expectations, and how expectations could eventually damage public trust if left unchecked. He was never asking his father to become cold. He was asking him to be clear. Charles accepted that truth in silence. The husband within him still felt Camilla's pain. The monarch within him knew the decision had been necessary. From that moment forward, both men stood united, not in celebration, but in quiet resolve. The palace could manage guest lists, access, ceremonies, and official procedures. It could never control the judgment of the public once the story reached the outside world. What had begun behind closed palace doors was now ready to become a national conversation about duty, loyalty, and the future of the crown.